The queen came back to a raid and found a human guard protecting her children. Nobody volunteers for the Velhari posting. That is not an opinion. That is a documented fact, backed by 3 years of assignment records, showing a 100% refusal rate among eligible personnel in the United Earth Auxiliary Corps. People would rather take latrine duty on a mining barge in the asteroid belt than spend 6 weeks babysitting alien eggs on a planet that smells like hot copper and something you cannot quite name, but that your body instinctively wants to move away from. I took it anyway. My name is Dara Kovacs. Sergeant, United Earth Auxiliary Corps, 8 years of service, 2 commendations I never talk about, 1 reprimand I never talk about either. 29 years old, 5'7", brown hair that I keep short, because helmets are miserable otherwise, and carrying enough student loan debt that hazard pay stopped being optional about 3 years ago. The Velhari diplomatic mission paid triple standard rate, 6 weeks on Vethkara, the Velhari homeworld, as a secondary guard attachment to the royal nursery, while the queen attended something called the Conclave of 7 Systems. My briefing document described it as a ceremonial summit of immense political importance. The line after that read, in plain text, no combat expected, low threat assessment, suitable for supplementary non-specialist deployment. That last part should have been a warning. Nothing in this corps with the words low threat assessment attached to it has ever once been low threat. But I was tired, I was broke, and the signing bonus cleared before I had time to reconsider. The transport that took me to Vethkara was called the Seraphine, a mid-range diplomatic courier that smelled like recycled air and someone else's coffee. I shared the cargo hold with 4 crates of cultural exchange gifts and 1 other human, a logistics officer named Gareth Pullman, who was delivering inventory records to the Velhari Trade Council, and who spent the entire 3-day journey reading a very long novel about fishing. He did not seem like the kind of man who had ever had a bad day in his life. I envied him deeply. Vethkara from orbit looks like a bruise. Deep purple landmasses separated by dark green oceans that reflect no light in any way that feels natural. The clouds move in patterns that look almost organized, which is because they are, though I did not know that yet. The Velhari have been managing their own planetary weather for something in the range of 800 years. They do not mention this casually, because to them, it is not impressive. It is simply infrastructure. The landing port was enormous, and almost completely silent. The Velhari do not make noise the way humans do. They communicate through a combination of pheromone release, very subtle body language involving their limbs, and a narrow range of clicking sounds that the translator in my earpiece did its best to interpret. The best it usually managed was approximately correct, which in diplomatic settings is either good enough or catastrophic, with very little middle ground. I was met at the port by Saveth, the Queen's Chamberlain. Saveth was approximately 7 feet tall, built along the lines of a praying mantis, if that praying mantis had decided to pursue a career in disapproval. She had 4 primary limbs, and 4 smaller secondary ones that she kept folded close to her thorax, in a way my briefing notes told me indicated authority. Her eyes were faceted in gold, and the first thing she did when she saw me was tilt her head in a direction my translator flagged as uncertain, followed by a pheromone release it rendered as either mild disappointment or mild confusion, with a confidence rating of 62%. She looked me up and down for a long moment. Then she said, through the translator, with that half-second delay that always makes conversations with Velhari feel like you are talking to someone standing just around a corner, "You are the auxiliary human. Sergeant Dara Kovacs." "Yes," I said. "Reporting for nursery attachment." Another pause. Another pheromone reading, this time rendered as resigned acceptance, confidence rating 71%. "Follow," she said, and turned and walked at a pace that required me to actually jog to keep up. The Nest Palace of Vethkara is not a building the way humans build things. It is grown. The Velhari secrete a resin compound that hardens into something with the structural integrity of reinforced concrete, but the texture and warmth of amber. Every surface curves. There are no sharp angles anywhere in the entire structure. Ceilings arch, doorways are oval. The floors are slightly uneven, in a way that is not careless but intentional, because the Velhari have never decided that perfectly flat ground is something worth achieving. The whole palace breathes with a low, constant hum, that I felt in my back teeth more than I heard with my ears. The nursery was at the heart of it. I heard it before I saw it. Not sound, exactly. Something below sound. A warmth in the air that was not temperature. A vibration in the floor that traveled up through my boots and settled somewhere behind my sternum. The door Savith led me to was sealed with what she explained, with visible reluctance, was a 3-stage pheromone lock. She would need to brief me on the emergency override codes. She did so the way a person hands over something valuable to someone they are 90% sure will drop it. The nursery itself stopped me in the doorway. It was cathedral-sized. The ceiling rose so high above me that the top of it was lost in a soft amber haze. The walls were lined from floor to ceiling with pods, thousands of them, each one roughly the size of a large watermelon, each one glowing faintly from within, with a light that shifted between pale gold and soft green as I watched. They were arranged in columns and rows that followed the curved walls, organized by some system I could not read yet, and between them ran thin channels of temperature-controlled fluid that kept the whole chamber at a perfect constant warmth. I stood there for a long time just looking at it. Savith watched me with her gold eyes and said nothing. "These are all royal bloodline?" I finally asked. "All royal," she confirmed. 3 generations of development. The youngest are 14 days. The oldest are 11 months. All are irreplaceable. I did the math quietly. Thousands of pods. Thousands of future Velhari, each one carrying the genetic and social lineage of a species that had been navigating interstellar politics since humanity was still arguing about which continent belonged to whom. Irreplaceable was not a word Savith used lightly, I suspected. It was not a word I intended to take lightly either. The 4 Velhari royal guards were stationed at the inner posts. They were larger than Savith and built differently, with a heavier secondary limb structure and chitin plating along their thorax and upper limbs that was not decorative. They carried pressure lance weapons holstered in a way that was technically casual, but practically very fast to reach. They looked at me the way people look at furniture that has been placed in an unusual location, not hostile, simply confused about why it was there. One of them had a ridge of slightly raised chitin running along the left side of his head, an unusual marking. I started calling him Crest in my head immediately, because I needed something to call him, and he did not offer a name. None of them did. Savith gave me a full briefing, delivered in a tone that managed to be both thorough and faintly condescending at the same time. No weapons discharge inside the nursery, under any circumstances. The pressure differential from a standard weapon discharge could crack pods up to 12 meters away. No sudden movements near active pods. No loud sounds above approximately 65 decibels. My post was the inner observation point, secondary to the Velhari guards, and my responsibilities were monitoring the environmental panel on the east wall and reporting any anomalies to the senior guard. The senior guard was Crest. He did not acknowledge this when Savith pointed to him. He did look at me, briefly, and then looked away. The Queen arrived at the nursery for her departure inspection that same afternoon. Sovereign Vethkara Seal was not what I had expected, though I would have had trouble saying exactly what I had expected. She was taller than the guards, with a stillness about her that was different from their alertness. Where the guards were coiled, she was settled. Where they watched, she observed. She moved through the nursery slowly, touching pods with the tips of her secondary limbs, in a gesture that my briefing notes had described as a form of address, a way of speaking to larvae that had not yet developed the capacity to receive pheromone communication fully. She did not look at me once. She spoke to Savith in rapid pheromone and click, none of which my translator caught cleanly. Savith responded. The Queen touched 3 more pods, lingered for a long moment over one in the 7th column from the left, 4th row from the floor, and then turned and walked out. That was it. No acknowledgement, no instructions, no indication that she had registered my existence in any meaningful way. I stood at my post and watched her go. Savith paused beside me on her way out. The translator caught what she said as, "The Queen does not concern herself with supplementary personnel. Do not make her aware of you." I nodded. I understood. I was furniture. Functional, potentially useful furniture, that was expected to remain in its designated location and not require attention. I could work with that. The first week was quiet. The routine settled in around me like something that had always been there. 4-hour observation rotations, 2 hours of rest, meals from my own provisions because Velhari nutrition was entirely incompatible with human biology. I learned the environmental panel quickly because it was, at its core, just a monitoring system, and monitoring systems are monitoring systems regardless of what planet produced them. Temperature, humidity, fluid flow rates through the pod channels, atmospheric composition, ambient vibration levels. I learned what normal looked like. I learned what the tiny fluctuations meant. By the second week I had started talking to the pods. I want to be clear that I understood, on a rational level, that the larvae inside could not understand me. They were in early development. They were not yet remotely close to anything that could be called cognition, but the nursery was very quiet and very large, and I was one person in it for long stretches, and talking out loud was something I did when I was concentrated on a task, always had been, drove my bunkmates at training camp completely up the wall. I talked about nothing in particular, the monitoring data, things I noticed, random observations about the way the amber light shifted in the early morning cycle, very low voice, below 60 decibels, well within the guidelines. I noticed on day 11 that a pod in the 7th column, 4th row, the one the queen had paused over, was tilting slightly on its mounting. Not a malfunction. The mounting was flexible by design. The pod was moving on its own, turning about 7 degrees toward the nearest heat vent. I started calling that one Gerald. Crest caught me talking to Gerald on day 14. He stood at the edge of the column and looked at me for a long moment with his gold eyes and said nothing, and then went back to his post. I kept talking. By day 23, Gerald was not the only one moving. Several pods in the nearby columns had begun orienting slightly toward my position during my observation rotations. Not dramatically, 7 degrees, maybe 10. Barely noticeable unless you were watching the same pods every 8 hours. I mentioned it to Crest. He looked at where I was pointing. He looked at me. The translator caught his response as, "Larvae are not mobile within the pod structure." Confidence rating 68%. Which I was beginning to suspect meant either he was saying something too complex for the translator, or he was not entirely sure what to make of what he was looking at either. "I know," I said, "and yet." He looked at the pods again, then he walked back to his post. 41 days in, everything was routine. The nursery was warm and quiet, and smelled like copper and something almost sweet. I had logged 0 anomalies on the environmental panel. The larvae were developing on schedule, according to the monitoring data. Crest had not said another word to me, but had stopped looking at me like furniture, which I counted as progress. I was checking the fluid flow rates on the east panel when the hum stopped. Not faded, stopped. One moment it was there, a constant presence I had absorbed so completely into my background awareness that I barely noticed it anymore, and then it was simply gone. The nursery felt suddenly larger, colder, as if the building had held its breath. I turned around slowly. Crest and the 3 other guards were very still, the kind of still that is not calm, the kind that is the exact opposite of calm, compressed so tightly that it looks the same from the outside. Crest turned to look at me. "Human," he said. His translator voice was flat, but the pheromone reading my equipment caught alongside it was not flat at all. The translator rendered it as urgency, high intensity, confidence 91%. He had never hit 91% before. He said the 6 words I will hear in my memory for the rest of my life. "The Kethvor fleet has arrived." I knew the name. It was in my briefing documents, buried in the political background section I had read on the transport and half remembered. A rival faction. 3 generations of conflict with the Velhari crown bloodline. A grudge so old it had its own historical designation. And they had chosen now, while the queen was 12 light-years away, while the nursery held every heir this bloodline had. The plan was fast and brutal in its simplicity. Crest explained it in clipped translator sentences. They would hold the outer corridor, buy time for a distress signal to reach the queen's fleet. The nursery would be sealed. The Kethvor did not have the entry codes. It would take them time to breach. I would stay inside, with the larvae. He said it without hesitation, without apology. I was supplementary personnel, non-specialist, not part of the defensive calculation. The 4 guards moved to the door. Crest paused there, his secondary limbs already raised in a pre-combat configuration that the briefing notes had sketched, but that looked entirely different in reality. He looked back at me once. I could not read his face. I had never been able to read their faces. He sealed the door. The nursery was sealed. I was inside, alone with 10,000 larvae, and the warm amber light, and the silence where the hum used to be. I stood very still and listened. The distress signal transmission took 8 seconds. I tracked it on the environmental panel's secondary communication display, a feature I had learned about on day 3 and had never expected to actually use. The outer door held for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Then I heard the breach. And then, one by one, I stopped hearing 3 of the 4 guards. I pulled out my blade and looked at the door and thought very clearly and very carefully about what came next. The silence after the breach lasted exactly 11 seconds. I know because I counted. Counting was something to do other than stand there and listen to the absence of sounds that had been there a moment before, so I counted, and at 11, the outer environmental sensor on my panel registered movement in the corridor. 17 contacts. The panel was not designed for tactical tracking, but pressure sensors in the corridor floor read 17 distinct weight signatures, moving in a coordinated spread pattern. They were not rushing, they were moving carefully, the way people move when they are trying not to disturb something fragile. Which told me 2 things immediately. They knew about the pods. They knew that a pressure discharge in the nursery would destroy the very thing they had come here for. They wanted the larvae dead, but they wanted them dead deliberately, personally, in a way that could not be mistaken for an accident. This was not just a raid. This was a statement. And statements require the one making them to be close enough to be seen. That meant they could not shoot freely inside, not without risking cracking pods across the whole chamber. Neither could I. My sidearm stayed holstered. I ran through my inventory in about 4 seconds, the way you do when the math gets sudden and personal. Combat blade, edge good. 2 concussive grenades, designed for enclosed spaces, non-fragmenting. Pressure wave only. Rated for use in environments with sensitive equipment, if the yield setting was dropped to 40%. Not weapons. Technically tools for breaching interior doors. I had packed them out of habit, the way you pack anything when the mission is low threat. Because low threat is not the same as no threat, and habits exist for a reason. The barricade materials I had were 3 equipment crates from the monitoring station, 2 sections of removable floor plating I had noticed on day 6 were not actually fixed to the substructure, the east panel console itself if it came to that, and anything I could move from the pod column bases, which were heavier than they looked, and anchored in a way that made them difficult to shift, but not impossible. I started moving. The inner door was a different construction than the outer one. Heavier resin, oval shape, sealed with a pheromone lock from outside, and a manual bar latch from inside. I dropped the bar. Then I started stacking. Crates against the base. Floor plating leaned at an angle across the crates to distribute force. I wedged the corner of the east panel console sideways into the gap between the door frame and the first crate, and discovered, pleasantly, that it was exactly the right dimensions to create a cross brace. I had done this before, not with alien resin architecture and equipment crates, but the principle was identical. A door is only as strong as what is behind it. It took me 9 minutes. Then I went to work on the room itself. The nursery had systems I had been monitoring for 41 days, without ever thinking about them as anything other than life support. I started thinking about them differently now. The heat vents ran along the lower walls in a pattern designed to distribute warmth evenly across the pod columns. They were individually controllable from the east panel, which still had partial power since I had not knocked it entirely loose from its mounting in the barricade. The humidity nozzles were set in the ceiling at regular intervals. The light cycle system was run by a central controller behind a panel in the northeast corner. The fluid channels in the floors carried temperature-adjusted nutrient solution at a pressure of about 40 psi, which was not nothing. I mapped it all out in my head while I worked, the way I had been trained to map a space. Every entrance, every exit, every element that could be turned into an advantage if you needed one. The temperature in the corridor outside was standard Velhari interior range, comfortable for a species that ran about 8 degrees warmer than humans at baseline. I could spike the heat vents in the outer section, the part of the nursery closest to the inner door, to a level that would not damage the pods, which were insulated and individually temperature regulated, but would make the corridor environment significantly less comfortable for anyone trying to work methodically through it. I set the vents to maximum. Then I waited. They reached the inner door 14 minutes after the breach. The first attempt was a controlled pressure tool against the door seam, a precise and professional approach, the kind of technique that worked very well on an unbarricaded door, and worked considerably less well on one with 200 kilograms of equipment stacked against it. The door shifted. The bar latch held. The cross brace held. The crates compressed slightly and held. A pause. They reassessed. I was behind the second pod column from the door, crouched low, blade in my right hand. The concussive grenades were in my left hand, unarmed, yield set to 38%. Below the threshold that could crack a pod from any angle in the room. Tested. I had done the math 3 times. The second attempt was stronger. A coordinated push rather than a precision tool. The door bent. The bar latch bent. The cross brace held until the console shifted, and then it was just the crates. The door came open. The first one through was large, armored in a way that was different from Velhari chitin plating, synthetic material over the natural structure, a gray-green color. I could not see eyes or anything identifiable as a face. I could see the pressure lance weapons slung across the back, not in hand, because they needed their limbs free for close work. I threw the first grenade. Not at the target. At the floor, 2 meters in front of the door, in the narrow channel between the first pod column and the wall. At 38% yield in an enclosed space, a concussive grenade does not do spectacular damage. It does not need to. It creates a pressure wave that travels out in all directions, and that interacts very poorly with inner ear structures and joint connectors, both of which the Kethvor, like all Velhari-adjacent species in the same physiological family, had in abundance along their lower limbs. The first one went down. The second one, close behind, staggered. I was already moving. The blade is a tool I have used for 8 years, not decoratively. I will not describe the next 40 seconds in detail, because it was not elegant, and it was not planned, and it worked primarily because I was moving before they expected movement, and because the narrow space between the pod columns was not designed for a group spread. It funneled them, and a funnel is only useful if you are at the wide end. I came back to the second column with 2 of them down, 2 more retreating back through the doorway, and a cut across my left forearm that I had not felt until I looked down and saw it. Adrenaline has that quality. It is very good at delaying information you do not currently need. I wrapped the forearm with strip bandaging from my kit, one-handed, with my teeth, which is undignified but effective. They did not come through the door again immediately. That was smart. They pulled back and I heard movement in the outer section, quiet and organized. Reassessing. I used the time. The humidity nozzles in the ceiling were set to standard nursery levels, about 60%, which kept the pods healthy and the air in the room comfortable. I pulled the ceiling panel on the nozzle nearest the inner door, the one I could reach from the top of the second crate stack, and bypassed the percentage limiter. The nozzle went to full output. Water vapor is not a weapon in any technical classification. It also reduces visibility to approximately 3 meters and makes every surface in the affected area wet enough that footing becomes a problem, particularly for species whose lower limb structure uses adhesion pads rather than friction grip. I learned that about the Kethvor on day 2 of the posting. It was in the supplementary species briefing that nobody had expected me to read carefully. I had read it very carefully. The next attempt came in from 2 directions simultaneously, which showed good tactical thinking. They had split around the outer section, using the door and a partial breach they made in the north wall of the outer chamber, which I had not predicted. I had not considered the north wall as a breach point because it was the thickest section of the nursery structure, and I had assumed it would take too long to compromise. I had been wrong about that. I noted it, in the part of my brain that stores wrong assumptions for later review, assuming there was a later. The north wall breach put 2 of them into the back of the nursery, near the rear pod columns, and I had to redirect fast. The second concussive grenade went toward the north breach. I moved down the east wall at a run, keeping low, keeping inside the pod column shadows where the light was amber and uneven, and the silhouette of a human in dark clothing was harder to track than it would have been in a clear space. The next 15 minutes were the most concentrated and least describable period of my professional life. I used the fluid channel pressure in the floor, which I accessed via an emergency manual valve behind the northeast panel, to flood the floor of the south section to a depth of about 4 centimeters, which was enough to compromise the adhesion footing I had read about, and not enough to reach the pod bases. I used the light cycle controller in the northeast corner to drop the nursery into a strobe pattern at irregular intervals, which was not pleasant for anyone present, including me, but which was worse for the Kethfor, because I knew the room's geography by 41 days of walking it in the dark during rest cycle power saves, and they did not. I used the heat vents on their maximum setting in the southeast corner to create a rising thermal that interfered with the chemical communication signals they were using to coordinate movement. My translator picked up fragments of their attempts to coordinate and rendered them as garbled and incomplete, confidence ratings in the low 30s, which meant the vents were doing their job. I took 3 more hits during that period. Blunt force, all 3, because they had understood quickly that the pressure lances were not an option, and had switched to close-range impact tools. The first caught my right shoulder and went numb immediately. The second caught my ribs on the left side, and did not go numb at all, which told me something about the difference between nerve shock and actual damage. The third caught my right knee, and I went down on it, and had to come back up through a level of concentrated unpleasantness that I will not exaggerate, because it does not need exaggerating. I found Crest in the outer corridor, at the 1 hour and 40-minute mark. I had gone out there to check the outer door's structural status, calculating whether I could reseal it from inside, and nearly stepped on him. He was on the floor near the east wall, still alive, his upper secondary limbs in a position my briefing notes had flagged as a severe injury response. He had been there since the breach. I checked him the way I check any casualty: airways, circulation, structural integrity, as best I could assess across species. He was breathing. He was losing fluid from a wound along his left thorax that was not critical but needed pressure. I did not have species-appropriate medical supplies. I had field bandaging and surgical tape, and the understanding that Velhari's circulatory anatomy ran close enough to the surface along the thorax that external pressure would help. I used what I had. He looked at me while I was doing it, his gold eyes tracking, the translator picking up a pheromone output it rendered as confusion, high intensity, confidence 83%. "You're still here," he said. "Someone had to be," I said. I finished taping the bandage and checked the tension. "We calculated you would retreat," he said, "into the inner nursery. Seal yourself inside with the larvae. Wait." "I considered it," I said, which was true. I had considered it for about 4 seconds, around the time the inner door started moving, and then I had moved past it to the next option, because a sealed door only works if the things on the other side of it eventually stop trying to open it, and sealed doors do not stop things that are willing to keep trying. I helped him to the inner nursery. He could move with support. I got him to the wall behind the third pod column, which was the most structurally sheltered position in the room, and I left him there with a pressure bandage refreshed and a clear line of sight to the inner door. Then I went back to work. The remaining Kethfor rating members who were still mobile were 5 at that point. They had regrouped in the outer section. They were no longer attempting the door. They were, I realized when I checked the pressure sensor on the panel, drilling through the east wall in 3 separate locations. That was new. That was creative. I had to give them that. I thought about it for approximately 20 seconds, which is a long time when 5 people are drilling through a wall toward you. Then I went to the fluid channel main valve and increased the nursery side pressure to the maximum rated flow, opened every channel in the east wall section simultaneously, and let 41 days of environmental familiarity do the rest. The fluid, at maximum pressure and with every channel open, hit the drilling points from inside, with enough force to compromise 2 of the 3 drill heads. Not destroy them. Compromise. Set them back. Buy time. I did not have a plan that went past buying time. Buying time was the entire plan. The distress signal had gone out. The Queen's fleet was somewhere, calculating a hyperspace transit, moving at speeds I could not track from a nursery panel on a homeworld. I needed them to arrive before the east wall came down. I sat down with my back against the 4th pod column, in the amber light with the pods glowing gold and green around me. and I breathed carefully through my cracked ribs, and I talked. I do not know exactly when I started talking to the pods again. It was not a decision I made. It was the same thing it had always been, something I did when I was concentrating, when I was tired, when the room was too quiet or too loud or too uncertain. I talked at a low volume about nothing relevant. The panel readings, the fluid pressure, the way the amber light was a little warmer in the south corner than the north one. The fact that Gerald had tilted a full 12 degrees toward my position, which was far outside any normal range of pod mobility, and which I was choosing, for sanity reasons, to consider a coincidence. Crest, from the wall behind the third column, said, with his translator voice very quiet, "They respond to you." I looked at the pods around me, hundreds of them in the immediate area, all angled very slightly toward where I was sitting. "They respond to warmth," I said. "They respond to you," he said again. "I have watched them for 11 months. They have never done this." I did not have an answer to that. I looked at the pods, and the pods faced toward me in the amber light, and the drilling in the east wall had slowed, possibly because of the fluid pressure, possibly because they were reassessing again. "How long?" I asked, meaning the fleet. "Unknown," Crest said. "The conclave location is fixed. The transit time from that point to Vethkara is between 3 and 5 hours depending on drive configuration." I checked my internal timer. 2 hours and 6 minutes since the breach. "I can give you another 2 hours," I said. The translator paused, then, "You are one person." "Yes," I said. "I know." I got back up, slowly, and with significant discomfort, and checked the blade, and checked the grenade casing on the one remaining concussive device I had partially charged from the spent casing of the second one, a field improvisation that reduced yield further, but still produced a workable pressure wave, and walked toward the east wall. "I know exactly what I am," I said, mostly to myself. That was never the relevant question. The east wall held for 90 more minutes. So did I. When the drilling finally punched through in the southeast section, the breach was in a position I had prepared for, stacked with everything I had left to stack, and the next 40 minutes were the most uncomfortable of my life up to that moment. I took 4 more impacts. I gave back considerably more than that. The floor was flooded, and the light was irregular, and I knew every centimeter of the room, and they did not. And in a confined space against multiple opponents, those are the factors that matter more than how many of you there are. By the time my internal timer reached 3 hours and 57 minutes, 5 of the original 17 were still mobile, and I was on the floor against the 7th pod column, which was Gerald's column, doing something with my left arm that I suspected was going to require more than field bandaging to fix, and I had one working hand, and one blade, and the absolute clear and certain knowledge that I had approximately nothing left. The outer door opened, not breached, unlocked, from the outside. The sound of the lock cycling was the most specific sound I had ever heard in my life. I turned toward it and raised the blade, because I had nothing else to do, and I was not going to stop. Sovereign Vethkara Seal walked through the door. She was still in her diplomatic plating from the conclave, formal kitten patterns along her upper limbs and thorax that I had seen in photographs in the briefing documents, and that looked entirely different in person. Behind her came 40 Royal Vanguard soldiers who spread through the nursery in a deployment pattern that took approximately 15 seconds to complete, and that resulted in all 5 remaining mobile Kethvor in restraints before I had fully processed what I was looking at. The Queen walked forward through the amber light. She stopped 6 meters away. She looked at the barricade wreckage by the inner door. She looked at the bound Kethvor. She looked at Crest, stable against the 3rd column, looking back at her with gold eyes. She looked at the pods, thousands of them, every single one intact, not one cracked, and the larvae pressing against the inner walls of their pods, nearest to where I was sitting, which I had genuinely stopped noticing at some point in the last hour, because I had other things to focus on. Then she looked at me. I was sitting on her floor, my back against Gerald's column, bleeding from 4 separate sources that I was aware of, and probably some I was not, my blade still in my right hand, because I had not thought to put it away, looking up at a sovereign who stood 8 feet tall and had just crossed 12 light years at emergency transit speed, and I genuinely could not think of a single appropriate thing to say. She was quiet for a long time. Then she walked forward, slowly, and she lowered her primary limbs, both of them, the full horizontal position, palms facing down, and held them there. I knew that gesture. It was in the cultural briefing, listed as a formal acknowledgement between equals, used between Velhari of equivalent standing. It had, the briefing note specified, no documented instance of ever being used by a Velhari sovereign to a non-Velhari. She said, "Tell me what happened here, Sergeant." And I looked up at her and took a breath through my cracked ribs and said, "They came for the children. I was here." She looked at me for a very long moment. Then she looked at Gerald's pod, which was tilted a full 15 degrees toward my position at that point, which was probably visible from where she was standing. She said nothing else. She turned and began organizing the vanguard response. Her chamberlain, Savith, appeared from somewhere and began processing the Kethvor restraints. A medical team, Velhari, with equipment I did not recognize, moved toward Crest. Two of them moved toward me, slowly and with gestures that my translator rendered as non-threatening approach, which I appreciated. I put the blade away. I let them work on my arm. I sat in the nursery with thousands of larvae in their pods, all of them angled toward my position in the amber light, and I was very tired, and I hurt in numerous locations, and it was, without any particular competition, the strangest and most important 6 hours of my life. Gerald tilted a further 3 degrees while I was watching, 12 degrees now from standard orientation, moving toward warmth, moving toward the nearest reliable heat source, moving toward me. I thought, the Queen came back and found her children safe. That was the job. That was always the job. I thought, I hope the hazard pay covers the arm. 6 months is not a very long time in galactic diplomatic terms. I have been told this repeatedly by people who work in galactic diplomacy, and who have the exhausted eyes of individuals who have spent decades watching very small things take very long amounts of time. 6 months, they tell me, is barely an introduction. And yet in 6 months, a considerable number of things happened. The formal report on what the diplomatic corps was calling, in the most deliberately boring possible language, the Vethkara incident, ran to 412 pages, and concluded with a recommendation that supplementary human personnel deployed to sensitive diplomatic postings be given a more thorough tactical briefing. I read that conclusion and sat with it for a while. I am still not entirely sure how I feel about it. The Kethvor faction's backing was exposed at the conclave, not by any investigation I was part of, but by the Queen's testimony. She presented it personally, in session, in front of representatives of all 7 systems, and according to the diplomatic correspondent who filed a report I was later shown, the testimony was delivered with a precision that left no question as to what had happened, who had ordered it, and what the political implications were. The faction was finished within 3 weeks. 3 generations of conflict ended in a 3-hour testimony session. I was not present for any of that. I was in a Velhari medical facility for the first 11 days, which is an experience I will describe only as educational, and in the human diplomatic quarters after that, doing physical therapy on my arm with a specialist named Dr. Lena Marsh, who had a very calm voice and an expression of perpetual mild concern that I came to find genuinely comforting. Crest visited me on day 19. I was in the diplomatic quarters common room, working through a range of motion exercise with my left arm, when he appeared in the doorway. He stood there for a moment with the gold eyes and the chitin ridge along the left side of his head, the one I had named him for in my head 8 weeks ago, and I put the exercise band down and waited. He came in. He stood across the low table from me. He said nothing for about 30 seconds. The translator on my earpiece caught a pheromone output and rendered it as deliberate expression, medium intensity, no confidence percentage offered, which I had come to understand meant something outside the translator's reference library, something specific to context rather than general communication. Then he reached into the carrier at his secondary limb joint and placed something on the table. It was a token, roughly the size of my palm, made from the same amber resin as the Nest Palace walls, but darker, with a pattern pressed into the surface that I did not recognize. It caught the light and seemed to glow very faintly from within, the same way the pods did. I looked at it, and then at him. He said, "This is a binding of witness token. It is given when one has observed another act in a manner that the giver carries in memory with permanent weight. The translator had rendered that in the flat voice it used for formal register, which meant it was a phrase with a specific ceremonial meaning rather than casual speech. I picked up the token carefully. It was warmer than the room temperature. "I did not know you were watching," I said. "I was not," he said. And then I was. We looked at each other. I thought about the outer corridor, and his weight against my shoulder, and the bandage I had applied with one hand, and I thought about 41 days of standing at adjacent posts and not speaking, and I thought that this was probably the most complete conversation we had ever had. "Thank you," I said, because it was all I had that fit. He looked at the token in my hand, then he left. I held it for a long time. The formal reclassification came through official channels 2 weeks after that, buried in a diplomatic registry update that my handler in the Corps, a patient and extremely tired man named Quentin Ibarra, forwarded to me with a note that read simply, "Did you see this?" I had not seen it. I read it 3 times to make sure I understood what I was reading. The Velhari Imperial Registry is a classification system that has existed in continuous operation for somewhere between 400 and 600 years, depending on which historian you consult. Every species that has had formal contact with the Velhari is in it. The categories range from resource provider at the low end, through alliance partner and knowledge exchange, to bound guard caste, which is the category reserved for species whose relationship with the Velhari crown bloodline is classified as protective covenant, a legal and social framework with implications that xenodiplomacy specialists were, according to Quentin's follow-up note, actively arguing about. Humanity had been listed as auxiliary labor, non-combatant tier, since the Velhari made first contact 40 years ago. We were now listed as bound guard caste, royal proximity. First reclassification upward in 400 years. First non-Velhari species ever placed in that category. Quentin's third note said, "I have 17 messages from the Xenodiplomacy Division, and I am not going to forward them to you because they will not be useful to your recovery." I appreciated that more than I can say. The private message from the Queen came through on a Saturday morning, which I know because I was eating a very mediocre bowl of oatmeal when my communications terminal chimed with a priority flag I had never seen before on a personal message. It was routed through 6 separate encrypted relays, flagged at a classification level that my standard clearance barely covered, and translated by an AI system that included a notation in the header that the source pheromone patterns had contained elements outside standard translation matrices, meaning some of the rendering was approximate. It was not long. I will not reproduce it exactly because it was private and because the translation was approximate, but the meaning was this. She had assumed, when she assigned human supplementary personnel to the nursery, that humans value things they have created and do not feel obligation to things they have not. She had been wrong. She had updated her understanding. The larvae remembered my voice, which she said as a fact, without elaboration, in the way the Velhari state things, that their hive mind awareness simply registers as true. Gerald still tilted toward heat sources, which she described as unusual behavior, still unclassified. I was welcome to return to Vethkara when my injuries permitted, if I chose to. I read it 4 times. I ate the rest of my oatmeal. I looked out the window of the diplomatic quarters at a sky that was not Vethkara's purple and gray, but was instead a perfectly ordinary blue, which I had not stopped finding remarkable since I got back. Dr. Lena Marsh cleared me for full duty 11 days later. She gave me a firm handshake and told me the arm would hold, and that the ribs had healed cleanly, and that I should do the range of motion exercises for another 3 months, and not skip them. I told her I would not skip them. She looked at me with the mild concern expression, and said she believed me, and that it had been genuinely interesting to have me as a patient, and that she hoped my next assignment was quieter. I told her I hoped so too. I am writing this from the desk I mentioned at the beginning, the one I was not expecting to sit at. It belongs to the office of the Human Velhari Liaison Division, which is a department that existed before the Vethkara incident in a strictly administrative capacity, and which is currently being substantially restructured in ways that Quentin is navigating, with the patience of someone who has done very difficult things for a very long time, and has developed a philosophical relationship with bureaucratic complexity. I have been asked to serve as the first human attaché to the Velhari Royal Nursery, a permanent posting, which did not exist before, and which required a formal agreement between the United Earth Auxiliary Corps, the Velhari Imperial Council, and the Queen personally, before it could be created. The paperwork, Quentin told me, was extraordinary. I said yes before he finished describing the role. I want to say something about what happened on Vethkara, that I have been working out how to say for 6 months, turning it over during physical therapy, and in the quiet of the diplomatic quarters, and in the long transit between the Earth system and Vethkara, which I am currently on board right now, sitting at this desk, watching the navigation display show me the distance decreasing hour by hour. People have asked me, since the incident became known, what I was thinking, what made me stay, what made me fight when the guards expected me to seal the door and wait. The xenodiplomacy people want a policy answer. The Corps wants a training answer. A journalist who somehow got my contact information wanted something she called a human interest angle, which I did not provide because the phrase made my eye twitch. Here is the true answer, as honestly as I can give it. I stayed because they were small, and they were there, and they needed someone. That is all. I went through all the other calculations, the hazard assessment and the tactical options and the timeline math, and all of those things mattered, and I kept doing them, because you have to keep thinking, or you stop making good decisions. But underneath every calculation was the same bedrock fact. There were 10,000 small lives in that chamber, and I was the only one between them, and something that wanted to end them. And the only question that actually mattered was what I was going to do about that. I am human. I have been human for 29 years. Humans are not the strongest species in the explored systems. We are not the longest lived. We do not have the fastest reflexes, or the greatest sensory range, or the most sophisticated communication system. We have no hive mind to coordinate us, no pheromone language to express nuance without ambiguity, no 800-year history of planetary management. What we have is this. We are very, very bad at walking away from something small that needs protecting. It is not a decision. It is not a policy. It is not something that can be trained in or trained out. It is something that lives below the level of calculation, in the place where the real decisions are made before the brain finishes processing them. The Velhari could not have predicted it, because it does not appear in any of our observable tactical patterns. It does not make strategic sense. A supplementary non-specialist human should have sealed the door and waited. I know this because Crest told me so, plainly and without judgment, in the medical facility, while I was still attached to things I did not recognize. He told me what they had expected me to do, and he told me that every model they had run, every projection, every calculation based on observed human behavior in crisis situations, had produced the same result. I would seal the door. He said it with the gold eyes, and the chitin ridge, and the pheromone output the translator would not give me a confidence percentage on. I said, we run those models too. He tilted his head. And the conclusion? Depends on the person, I said. Depends on the room. Depends on what's in it. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said something the translator rendered haltingly, as, you were in the room. Yes, I said, I was. I have thought about that exchange many times in 6 months. I think Crest understood something in it, that I was only halfway articulating. The question was never really what humans do in crisis situations as a general category. The question was, what a specific human does when placed in a specific room with specific small lives depending on them, when the door closes and the choice becomes entirely, personally, irreducibly theirs. The answer to that question is not universal. I know humans who would have sealed the door and made the right tactical choice and saved themselves, and I am not saying they would have been wrong. Survival is not cowardice. Calculation is not failure. But I am also not them. I was Dara Kovacs in a nursery on Vethkara, with a blade and 2 concussive grenades, and 41 days of knowing every corner of that room. And those children were there. And I was there. And the answer I found was the only answer I had. The navigation display shows, I am 9 hours from Vethkara orbit. I have reviewed the current nursery personnel configuration, the updated security protocols that were implemented after the incident, the new wall reinforcement specifications, and the revised post-rotation schedule. The security is considerably better than it was. Crest, fully recovered, has redesigned the outer corridor defensive architecture. There is now a dedicated communication channel to the Queen's fleet that operates on a continuous handshake protocol. The nursery environmental systems have been reclassified as tactical assets and are formally incorporated into the defensive plan. And there is one human attaché, permanent posting, integrated into the primary rotation for the first time in the history of the posting. I am bringing my own coffee this time, 4 months supply. I know exactly how the ration situation works out there. I am also bringing a small portable heat emitter, compact enough to fit in a kit pocket, the kind used for cold weather camping. I tested it on a sample pod in the core laboratory, with permission, and with a xenobiology consultant present, and with enough documentation to satisfy 3 separate oversight committees, and confirmed that the heat signature it produces falls within the range of what pod-mounted larvae respond to in terms of orientation behavior. Gerald is going to tilt so far he falls off the column. I cannot wait to see it. The Velhari built their whole understanding of humanity on what they could observe from outside. Observable tactical patterns, resource exchange behaviors, social organization structures, communication methods, all of it accurate, all of it carefully documented, all of it missing the thing you cannot see from outside, the thing that does not appear in any observation, because it only activates when the door closes and the room goes quiet, and the choice becomes simply and entirely yours. We are at our most ourselves when something needs protecting, and the only thing standing between it and the danger is us. That is not a policy. That is not a training outcome. That is not something that appears in a capability assessment, or a threat model, or a deployment briefing. It is just what we are. The navigation display shows 8 hours and 41 minutes to Veth-Karara orbit. I save the log entry. I pick up the binding of witness token from where it sits on the corner of the desk, warm in my palm the way it always is, and I hold it for a moment, and then I put it back. I get up and make another cup of coffee and go back to reviewing the nursery schematics, because I have 9 hours and there is always more to learn about a room before you stand watch in it. I am going back to my post. Gerald is waiting. End.